Thanks for joining us. We've
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
We've got yeah, wonderful to see so many of you online this afternoon to discuss the New South Wales Koala Strategy and the opportunity that it presents to try and get better outcomes for koala management across New South Wales. I'm Jackie, I'm the CEO of the Nature Conservation Council, and I'm joined today by Bev Smiles out in Mudgee and Dailan Pugh on the North Coast, who are going to be speaking about the koala strategy, but also the various threats to koalas in their areas. And sort of, what the opportunity this koala strategy affords us in terms of trying to get better outcomes for koalas. Before we kick off, I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining this webinar from the lands of the Awabakal people and want to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge First Nations people all across New South Wales and the First Nations people of the country where you're calling in from. And if you'd like to acknowledge country, you can jump in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from this afternoon. As we go through the presentations, please do feel free to use the chat, whether you want to post any questions or comments as we go along, do that in the chat. At the end of both Dailan and Bev's presentations, I'll have a look at the chat for any questions and we'll use the chat function to put questions to our presenters. And then at the end, we'll talk a bit about how you can make a submission into the Koala Strategy discussion paper. So Ed, if you could kick us off with some slides, that would be wonderful. Yeah, so as much as it's sometimes hard to believe that such an iconic species as the koala could be so terribly mismanaged by the Australian government, by the government here in New South Wales, that's exactly the situation we're in. A few years ago, there was a parliamentary inquiry here in New South Wales that found koalas are on track for extinction under a business as usual scenario by 2050. Since that parliamentary inquiry took place, there's been no material difference in how we manage for koalas and protect their habitat in New South Wales. So we are still very much on that trajectory of, towards extinction by 2050. Koala habitat is being cleared on public and private land across New South Wales. And, there are very little safeguards in place and those that are really laughable in terms of how we protect koalas and their habitat across this state. And some of that does come down to the data and what we know about where koala habitat is. But, it's largely because of political will or a lack thereof when it comes to how we protect the species. So this webinar, we really wanted to schedule as part of this process around a revision of the New South Wales Koala Strategy and also off the back of the New South Wales Koala Summit, which was held as part of that process at Taronga Zoo a couple of weeks ago. And Dailan and I were both there. And this, both the summit and this submission process around the koala strategy have been put forward by the government as opportunities for us to have a say in what next for the koala strategy in New South Wales. So a little more on how we got to this point. Next slide, if you could, Ed. In the lead up to the election in March last year, the New South Wales government committed to a process for the Great Koala National Park. That process is underway, and I think the latest timeline that they've sort of flagged is having that park gazetted by the end of this year. So it's taken a while to get there, and probably the most outrageous part of this process is that Forestry Corporation are in the proposed Great Koala National Park footprint, logging areas that are slated to become national park. And in fact, when the announcement for the Great Koala National Park came out, yeah, they maybe Ed, if you can, the Forestry Corp ramped up their plans to get out timber before it becomes national park. The other thing just to mention is what's happening at a federal level, we also had a commitment from the federal Labor government to an overhaul of our federal environmental legislation, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. Under the EPBC Act, as it currently stands, there is a carve-out for forestry in New South Wales under the regional forestry agreements. So koalas are a protected species under the EPBC Act. However, that protection doesn't apply to our koalas in state forests where logging is active. So not only is that incredible weakness already existing in that law, Labor did flag that they would revisit the RFAs as part of the EPBC reform. But just yesterday, they announced that they won't be delivering on that environmental reform in this term of government. They've split out the different elements of EPBC reform, and they're saying they're only going to be able to deliver a federal EPA at this stage, and haven't said when the rest of those reforms under the EPBC Act will come through. So we certainly can't be relying on federal government for protection of koalas either. Thanks, Ed. So here in New South Wales, as I said, koala protection is a mess and woefully inadequate, and our koalas are still very much on a trajectory towards extinction by 2050. If you were following the news back in 2021, you will have heard about the New South Wales koala wars, where John Barilaro was threatening Gladys Berejiklian and threatening to blow up the coalition government over changes to the state environmental planning policy, which is the key piece of legislation that the government uses in terms of how they protect for koala habitat. I don't know if it's just me, but I've just lost the slides, Ed. I'm not sure if that's the same for others. Oh yeah, there we go, back again. Thank you. So koalas have been a bit of a political hot potato. Our politicians know that people love koalas, and it's a huge legacy issue for successive governments, where Gladys Berejiklian made this great claim that they were going to double koala populations in the wild. Obviously they're a cute and cuddly iconic species that do get a lot of media. However, because habitat protection requires reining in land clearing for agriculture and development, protection of koala habitat has been seriously hamstrung along the way by those vested interests. So I'm going to hand over to Dailan now to talk a bit more about the situation that we're in and how we got to this point in terms of koala management in New South Wales. Thanks, Dailan.
Thank you. So I'm on Arakwal country, and I'd like to give a bit of a background as to the current situation we've got. So the New South Wales Koala Strategy was derived in the midst of the koala wars. So next slide, thanks. Yep. So this is just the context of it. So this is what was going on at the time. So, we had in June 2020, we had the inquiry finding that koalas were likely to become extinct in the wild by 2050. So that set off the koala wars. So in response to that, the National Party basically declared war on koalas and protection of koala habitat, and it just went crazy. It was quite amazing. Here we have this assessment that koalas are in imminent danger of extinction, and the Nationals declared war on koalas. So, and that went on for a couple of years, really. So it started off with the koala inquiry, and they just wound back everything they could thereafter in terms of protecting koalas. So give a bit more detail. Next slide. Thanks, Ed. So basically for private land, back in 1995, they did state environmental planning policy called a SEP. I think it was SEP 44, koala protection. And the idea of that was for koalas to map core koala habitat and zone it for protection in environmental zones. So it was a basic precept. precept. So that was a great idea, really. And then in 2007, they did their code of practice for private native forestry, and that prohibited logging in core koala habitat. And then a bit belatedly, but in 2016, Cabinet agreed that core koala habitat would be identified as sensitive regulated lands and require approval for clearing. So, you know, all good stuff, you know, let's protect koala habitat was the idea. But the trouble was, by 2020, only 6 koala plans of management had been approved, and they were mostly just for parts of council areas. So they covered about 5,000 to 6,000 hectares. So, you know, that's a pretty poor outcome after 25 years of this policy. And a lot of those core koala habitat had previously been approved for logging. So most of it was available for logging, and there wasn't much protected at all. So in March 2020, there was a new, what they call SEP 19. So it was adopted in 2019, but didn't come into effect till March. And it made it easier to identify core koala habitat. So suddenly, you know, here was this opportunity for council to identify core koala habitat across New South Wales. And so the loggers basically freaked out. This was just too much for them because, of course, it was core koala habitat. They wouldn't be able to log it. And then the farmers too freaked out. They need to get approval for clearing it. And so with that pressure, that scared the National Party, who until then had been supportive of it. And the National then went to war against the Liberal government, saying, get rid of this state environmental planning policy. It's too much. And it's actually threatened to resign from the coalition. I think it was an empty threat, but anyway, it threatened to resign from the coalition unless it was got rid of. So the Liberals then promised that there'd be no core koala habitat that was identified, included in environmental zones under local environmental plans. That was their first concession. So it wouldn't be protected, as was the original intent. And then they agreed to removing restrictions on clearing and logging. So basically removing all this hard-won protection, theoretical protection for core koala habitat. And then in October 2020, they despite these assurances, the National Party were given free range to do the Local Land Services Amendment Miscellaneous Bill. And it proposed no protection of core koala habitat, but also proposed allowing logging in all council environmental zones. So areas that have been protected for decades, environmental values would suddenly all be opened up for logging, and some of it for clearing as well as in all areas protected by other SEPs. So that includes wetlands, rainforests, etc., would all be opened up for logging. And then there were double logging approvals from 15 to 30 years. But that fell apart. It was drawn after Catherine Cusack crossed the floor. She was the sole Liberal member to do so, but she had in effect the balance of power in the upper house. And so they had to withdraw this retrograde legislation. And so instead of that, to placate John Barilaro, they did SEP 19. They resurrected SEP 1995 as SEP 2020 for rural land. They knew it was hard to implement. They watered it down a bit as well. And then, you know, because of the continued backlash in the next year, they resurrected SEP 2019 as SEP 2021, but only for urban land, so of limited application. So they're now included in the State Environmental Planning Policy, Biodiversity and Conservation 2021. And then, you know, not being content with that, in December 2022, they tried once again, to do a legislative change to open up all environmental zones on for logging as well. So next one, please. Ed. So while all that was going on with private land, or actually before it, we have the state forest rule. So this is, you know, public land where logging is allowed to occur. So in 1997, after years of inaction, for state forests, they adopted logging rules that required pre-logging surveys for koalas. So this was required extensive surveys for koala scats, and protection of koala high use areas where enough scats, where koala scats were found to meet the criteria. And it's very high criteria, by the way. Not many places met those requirements for koala high use areas, but nonetheless, some did. As well as that, they required the retention of 5 koala feed trees per hectare in areas where koala had been recorded or was suitable koala habitat. But, you know, once again, only about 200 hectares of koala high use areas were identified in 20 years. So forestry just weren't doing the surveys. They weren't identifying these koala high use areas by and large. And most of them were just being logged as if they didn't exist. So we found a really important koala area in 2012. So we started trying to implement this requirement. But again, as I said, they were high. The criteria were quite strong. So, you know, we didn't find many of them, but we started beginning to find some here and there and getting them protected from logging. And then so the government didn't like this because we were trying to enforce forestry to meet the requirements to do these surveys because they weren't doing them. So in 2018, they changed the logging rules. This is the what they call the CIFOA. And so they dropped the requirements for pre-logging surveys for koalas. They removed the need to protect koala high use areas. And so instead of that, they used modelled koala habitat to set a tree retention. So they referred that to the Environmental Protection Authority and to their expert fauna panel they had. And they made a number of recommendations and the forestry objected to those. So they brought in the Natural Resources Council to resolve the differences. And the outcome was that the NRC just did what forestry wanted. And so rather than the trees greater than 25 centimetres DBH, you know, the larger trees, koalas prefer trees over 30 centimetres DBH, and there's plenty of evidence for that. The NRC adopted 20 centimetres diameter at breast height as the trees to retain, and these because they don't log them, so we may as well retain them if you're not going to log them, you know. So, and then the EPA and the fauna panel suggested retention rates, you know, varying from 15 to 25 trees per hectare, koala feed trees per hectare of these smaller sizes in according to modelled habitat, which is pretty inaccurate. But the NRC went with forestry and adopted a lot lower requirements, basically from 5 to 10. And the other requirement, of course, in the new logging rules is you've got to wait for koala to leave before you cut down this tree. So yes, have a look for koalas before you log by all means. If you find a koala, just wait for it to piss off and you can cut down its feed tree. So this was widely criticised by the Office of Environment and Heritage plus many others. It was just grossly inadequate, but still retained. So next slide, please. So this is just an example. This is Braemar State Forest. So in July 2019, we found an exceptional density of koalas in a proposed logging area in Braemar State Forest, and we estimated that over 100 hectares would qualify as koala high use areas. To put it in context, you know, they only identified 200 hectares in the previous 20 years. So this was a pretty special area. And, you know, certainly from all our searches, it was certainly a very special area. So what forestry did, because they're operating under the old rules, they switched to the new rules, redid their logging plan, and so they just need to retain 5 koala feed trees per hectare, which they had to do anyway, as well as the koala high use areas beforehand. Then, you know, really regrettably in October 2019, it was burnt out overnight in a wildfire. It was very devastating. Over 70% of the koalas were killed. You know, some of my estimations are with the drought afterwards, over 80% were killed. And then we managed to hold them at bay. But then 3 days after the election, when the Minns government was elected, the forestry announced it was going to be logged. And we asked Penny Sharp to intervene, but she refused to intervene. We got surveys done there with Steve Phillips, and we found most of the koala habitat was occupied again. Numbers were reduced, but they were back, you know, and they were recovering. In August last year, we took the Forestry Corporation to court, but we lost, unfortunately. And in December last year, logging started, and so far about a third has been logged. And you know, the evidence of Dr. Phillips in the court case was applying the logging rules to such an important area that had been so badly affected by the fire was likely to cause the local extinction of these koalas. But that doesn't matter to this government. So next slide, please. So this is the current logging that's going on, or it's stopped at the moment because it's too wet. You know, they can remove over 70% of the koala's preferred feed trees. Either the larger feed trees over 30 centimetres diameter that koalas prefer, of the species they prefer, over 70% of them can be taken out, and yet they claim it has no impact on koalas. And so that's what they can log. So next slide, please. And then there's just incidental damage to so many other koala feed trees in the process. These are grey gums. You know, in this area, it's their by far their preferred koala feed tree. Every grey gum you see will have koala scratches on it. They use them extensively, and so they're not only can they log all most of the larger ones, they just bash them. And trees like those ones in the middle of the photo there that have been heavily damaged by the logging operation, we complain to the EPA about stuff like that, and they say, no, it's not damage. It doesn't count as damage. It's illegal to damage trees, but they say, no, it doesn't count as damage. The trees will recover. It's all fine. I mean, really, it's just outrageous what they get away with. So next slide, please. So here, we go to the Koala Strategy that was adopted in April 2022. So in the midst of, or toward the end of the koala wars. And with the goal to double New South Wales koala populations by 2050. No one believes that's really what they're intending, and they're going to spend $193.3 million for the first 5 years. You know, so their idea is to throw money at the problem. But at the same time, they were proposing nothing to protect koalas on state forests. So they already removed the protection, and they weren't going to reinstate anything, and only voluntary measures on private land. They weren't going to require any area to be identified as core koala habitat and protected, and they'd removed all the protection anyway for core koala habitat, except when a developer's doing a development application to council. There's still some requirements there. So they allocated $107 million for their key pillar, which was habitat protection restoration. So that was to buy koala habitat. So they wanted to protect 22,000 hectares of koala habitat on private land through voluntary processes, through buyback to add to national parks, or through conservation agreements with landholders, and create 25,000 hectares of new habitat. So they go out and plant koala habitat rather than protecting what was there. So far, they've purchased 10,000 hectares for additional national parks, entered conservation agreements over 7,700 hectares, and undertaken restoration of 7,400 hectares, or at least partial restoration. I've tried to get the figures, but I haven't been able to yet. But at the same time, we have this national process going on. So we've got a national koala recovery plan. And one of it's, you know, again, identifying koala and protecting koala habitat is one of the key requirements, obviously. So they require the identification of nationally important koala areas, NICAs. And so they were identified in 2021, and they identified 1 million hectares on the New South Wales North Coast of nationally important koala areas. And over 230,000 hectares of those NICAs are on state forests that can be protected right now. So on the map there, they're the red areas. So the pink's all the nationally important koala areas. The aqua blue is, or aqua green is where they're on national parks. There's not a lot you'll see. Most national parks aren't suitable koala habitat, and the red are the areas that are on state forest that could be protected tomorrow. So next slide, please. So what can we do? You know, basically, I think we've got to save koalas' homes. I think that's the most urgent thing we can do, is protect where koalas live. You know, we can do all these other things like traffic calming and so on. Those problems are just getting worse and worse. Whereas we could go and protect the core areas where koalas live, at least they're going to have a fighting chance. And that's the quickest and cheapest way to improve their survival prospect, particularly by protecting koala habitat on state forests. This is public ownership already. We don't need to pay to buy it, and we don't need to rely upon the goodwill of whoever owns it to give it to us. You know, we are the public. We can protect the best koala habitat. But we do need to work out a transition strategy for the industry out of those areas. And so, you know, for state forests, we need to exclude highly suitable koala habitat basically adopting the definition of that so it's highly suitable koala habitat, got the right number of tree species in it, so it's good quality koala habitat where koalas are present or have been recorded in the past 18 years. And we've got to protect them from logging. And we've got to require independent pre-logging koala surveys, not just if you see a koala in the tree, wait for it to go before you cut it down. And for private lands, we need to fix up the state environmental planning policy. So we've got to bring back the 2019 SEP. That's now Chapter 3 of the SEP, and really get rid of Barilaro's sellout SEP. We've got to take on the role. We need a government to take on the role of actually mapping core koala habitat across all tenures, including for comprehensive koala plans and management. We need the government to do it because it hasn't worked getting councils to do it in an ad hoc manner. And, there's certainly major efficiencies in getting the government to do it. And we've got to require that site-specific koala plans and management for, housing developments and so on, be prepared before any activity that removes significant vegetation within high-quality koala habitat. Currently, it's only the site-specific koala plans and management are required if a council gets a DA doing deciding and development application. So like the government can come in, approve an area for rezoning, approve a master plan for it, it gets it all subdivided up into blocks and not have to consider consider koalas at all. And the last one is we've got to restore the intent to zone core koala habitat for environmental protection. So bring back the original intent of the 1995 SEP and protect it from logging and clearing. So that's what they're my requests. So thank you for your time.
That's great. Thanks, Dailan. I always learn something more whenever I hear from you. So thank you. And there was a lot of information in there and a lot of really helpful information for putting in a submission to the koala strategy. So I'm sure I know I'll have to go back and listen again to digest some of that. So we're recording this presentation and we'll send it around if you do want to go back and have another look and take some of that on. I just noticed there was a comment in the chat here about the upcoming council elections and sort of using every opportunity to put pressure on our state MPs and using the council elections as an opportunity to ask candidates to do that. And I think that's a really wonderful reminder of how important that constituent pressure is on our state MPs. And Dailan mentioned Catherine Cusack, who crossed the floor to sort of avoid, try and avoid some of the weakening of those koala protections. And we spoke to Catherine not long after that happened. And one of the things that she mentioned was the amount of correspondence that she received from people in the lead up to that decision and just how influential that can be for MPs when making decisions. So yeah, just want to reiterate how important that is. I'll go straight to Bev now, and we'll have some questions for both Dailan and Bev after we've heard from Bev. So moving across the state now, a bit further west out to Mudgee. Thanks, Bev.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie, and thanks everyone for joining. I just had a major thunderstorm start, so I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, so I'm meeting with you tonight from Wiradjuri country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I'm going to be concentrating on what's happening in the Mudgee area with some case studies to do with mining and the fact that there's no real protection for koala habitat with mining projects, particularly because they're state significant development. So while state policy for environmental protections have to be considered, they don't necessarily have any impact on the decision to go ahead and approve the mine, and there's generally a reliance on offsets. So the first slide I've got is to show the fact that our local council, Mid-West Regional Council, actually have done some mapping of core koala habitat that shows there's significant areas in our shire where the red circle is showing the position of a large lead, silver and zinc mine near a village called Louis. And the biodiversity assessment for this mine was absolutely appalling. And the consultants went out of their way to not find any evidence of koalas, of course, on the area. We think they must have been blindfolded while they were doing their transects, because the local community is fully aware that there are a lot of koalas in that vicinity. And as you can see from the mapping, it's in a core area. And if you go up to the north of that map, that's where our major coal mine projects are. They're all in the currently wanting to expand as well. And one of the major ones that is currently up for approval is also in this core koala habitat area. So our concern with the current koala strategy is that this important core koala habitat in the Mudgee region doesn't have a look in any of the mapping that currently sits with the strategy. So, I mean, it's an indication of how poor the background work is for the strategy, and we're really pushing from our local perspective that at least this region gets some recognition in any review of the strategy. But there are lots of other parts of Western New South Wales, you know, over the Great Dividing Range that have important koala habitat, not necessarily being impacted by forestry, although any forestry areas left in Western New South Wales, you know, is important habitat for anything. But we've got this major mining expansion going on in the Central West, and the fact that the rural land set is the one that's currently the one that is impacting that policy is what has to be taken into consideration for these mining proposals. So under SEP 2020 for rural land use zones, core koala habitat is defined as an area of land with a resident population of koalas, evidenced by attributes such as breeding females, being females with young, and recent sightings of and historic records of a population. And as we know, the koala was upgraded from vulnerable to endangered under the Federal Environment Law in 2022. And the referral guidelines for koala identifies that the loss of 20 hectares or more of high quality habitat critical to the survival of the species is highly likely to have a significant impact for the purpose of the EPBC Act. So this lead, zinc and silver mine that was approved by the previous coalition government in New South Wales, but has not yet been approved by Tanya Plibersek. It's been approved to clear 384.7 hectares of core koala habitat in that Midwest region mapped area. So as I've said, you know, the assessment to this mine tried to prove the area wasn't core habitat. But the people in the Louis area have been out and about photographing and formally recording koala sightings. So Ed, that'll be the next slide, thanks. Yeah, so they've set up a Facebook page and encouraging local people to post and to formally record all their sightings in the area. So, I mean, we're asking for at least this area to be included in the strategy for further research and filling knowledge gaps. There is one good study underway that's part of a broader Blue Mountains study, and that researcher is, you know, just really gobsmacked about, you know, the health of the population she's finding in our region. The other big ticket item that we're currently campaigning for, so if we could have the next slide, thanks, Ed, is the expansion of the Moolarben coal mine. As I said, under the that core habitat map that I showed you in the earlier slide, this is up to in the northern part of the mapped area of core koala habitat. This is out of the company's own assessment that shows all the records of koala in the area or adjacent to the area that they want to open cut for coal. And it's right up against the Munghorn Gap Nature Reserve, which has a significant population in that reserve. So what we're calling for is for the government not to approve expanding this coal mine for all of the reasons why we know that coal mining shouldn't be expanded, but also to protect this core koala habitat, and that this area be actually included into the Munghorn Gap Nature Reserve. So in our campaign, we've just generated a short video. So if you can show us that, thanks, Ed.
We haven't got sound, Ed.
No, there's not much sound with it. I think there's just...
Oh, we don't need sound. Okay.
Yep.
Great. Sorry. Thanks, Bev.
Just one other thing. So, I mean, again, this assessment report for this mine actually identified that the habitat within the study area may be considered as critical to the survival of the local population, and that the project may result in increased mortality and physiological stress of the species through fragmentation of landscape, stress and vehicle strike. It's considered that the project has potential to lead a long-term decrease in the size of the population, and that the project would result in the removal of 113.2 hectares of habitat for the koala. As such, the project is considered likely to affect habitat that has the potential to be critical to the survival of the species. So how any government could even consider approving this mine under those circumstances is beyond us, and we're looking for all the support we can get to stop the New South Wales government from approving this mine. So thanks a lot, Jackie.
Thanks, Bev. Yeah. Pretty grim state of affairs. I'll take some questions from the chat, and maybe while we're still on the subject of the mines that you mentioned, Bev, somebody has asked whether the mining projects that you've spoken about are open for public submission, and if people can engage in that process as well as the koala strategy process.
Yep, so the Louis mine has been approved by the New South Wales government, where there's been a lot of pressure put on Clippersec to not sign off on the federal act, and she hasn't yet. So there's the local community's been bombing her office and also putting pressure through connections with the ALP. So we're still not sure where that's got to, but she does have the power to reject the project from the endangered species perspective. As we know, they generally go into the joke of finding offsets, and this the Louis mine was actually approved before any offsets had been found anywhere. And there's also the option to pay money into, the Conservation Trust account. So yeah, that one's still in abeyance, but the local community is seeing the koala as actually maybe their saving point. For the Moolarben Open Cut 3 expansion, it's been through its initial public exhibition, but thanks to everyone's support, we got enough objections to send it to an independent planning commission. We're expecting that public hearing to happen in Mudgee, possibly mid-year. So we'll certainly be looking for support from the community within that process as well. But we thought this koala strategy was a really good opportunity for us to raise the fact that mining's just not considered anywhere in the strategy, and it is total clearing and as you see, just totally destroying the landscape. And we'd like to thank Jackie for coming along on Friday to speak at a rally that we're holding in Mudgee to really highlight our concerns about the lack of protection for core koala habitat in our region. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Bev. And there's also a bit of interest in any local community Facebook pages that people could follow, or how they could stay up to date with the local campaigns out there. So if you're able to post any links to pages like that in the chat now, Bev, otherwise we can certainly send those around after the webinar. And yeah, just to restate again that we'll be sharing this recording, so you'll be able to see the slides again and listen back on our presenters. A question that came up earlier was to do with federal legislation as well, and I'm wondering, Dailan, if this is one that you might want to take, is just any commentary on the nature repair bill that came into Parliament late last year.
Well, the problem we have in northeast New South Wales is it's a regional forest agreement, and so you can log on private lands, or you can log on state forests, and there's no requirement to comply with law. So we did try. A court case was heard earlier this year to knock over that federal legislation, that exemption, because the regional forest agreement has been extended forever, really indefinitely. So it gets rolled over every 5 years. They're called evergreening, goes on forevermore. So all based on assessment in 1997, and we know a lot since then, but that has no bearing on it. So until such time as the federal government honours their commitment to remove that exemption that the Regional Forest Agreement gives to under the EPBC Act, or any future requirements to come up, really New South Wales can do what they like.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's another question there around what the legal avenues are that, given how outrageous some of these, impacts are that we're talking about on koala populations, whether there are legal paths that can be taken to challenge the, obvious impacts, and particularly in relation to the mining that you're talking about, Bev. But I think, as Dailan's pointed out, the law is inadequate. So if the law isn't, the law isn't there and isn't working, it's really hard to pursue legal avenues if they're not breaking the law, because the law allows for this kind of destruction. But Bev, do you know if there are any other legal avenues specifically in relation to the mines that you mentioned? You're on mute again. Sorry, Bev. maybe we'll just move on and hopefully you can. Oh yeah,
Yeah,
there you
look,
go.
I'm sorry about that. I'm actually having a bit of trouble with my computer. Yeah, look, I mean, we do need the federal laws strengthened, but as far as projects like mines, the federal minister currently does have the power to reject them under federal law. So while, you know, it's unfortunate that forestry's been exempted, projects like mine, she does have that power.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just to speak directly to the submission process. So the New South Wales Koala Strategy is it's a New South Wales state government strategy and it's a state government process. So the opportunity that's live now is to input into that process, and there's a discussion paper which has been released by the New South Wales Government that's open for input until I think it's the 26th of April. So a bit less than 10 days to feed into that. And Ed, I might get you to post some links in the chat, both to the actual strategy, but also to the discussion paper, which is the thing that's open for submissions, and also where people actually can go to make a submission. And thanks, Ed, has also popped in there submission guides from both Northeast Forest Alliance, where Dailan, which Dailan is representing, and from Bev's group in Mudgee. So you can have a look at some of those links for submission guides. In terms of putting in a submission, there's two ways you can input your feedback into the New South Wales Koala Strategy. One is directly emailing the department with your input, and the other is filling out an online form. The online form is relatively comprehensive. I think there's 23 or 24 questions, and it goes through the different elements of the strategy around protecting koala habitat, Carl strike, I think a few other, there's a few different pillars to the strategy, so you can go through that and comment on where you think the inadequacies in the strategy are. I think in terms of this group and the opportunity that we have here as a bit of a coordinated group of people who are obviously all on the same page about wanting to see a strengthening of the strategy and see this as an opportunity for how we protect more koala habitat. If there is a lot of people putting in submissions calling for the same thing, which is stop chopping down koala trees, then I think that's really important for the government to be getting a coordinated message. So I would really encourage you to have a look at the submission guides, and again we'll send around an email following this webinar with a bit more information on how you actually put in a submission. And certainly at Nature Conservation Council, and I know across New South Wales, Northeast Forest Alliance and a number of other forest groups have all been calling for an end to native forest logging for a long time. So having a uniform message in our submissions around protecting trees, protecting koala trees, ending native forest logging, protecting koala habitat, I think will be really critical in terms of that uniform message getting through. So have a look at some of those links in the chat and keep an eye on your email for some helpful information on putting in a submission to the strategy. Dailan or Bev, did you want to make any further comments on the sort of key messages you think it's important for people to include in their submissions?
Yeah, well, I just think that, the core koala habitat across the state really must be mapped and included in the strategy for protection, and it must be protected from all forms of development and clearing for any purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bev. Great. Yes, and we will email all of those links out in the follow-up, as well as a link to this webinar. Are there any final questions before we wrap up? Great. Well, thanks very much for joining us. Thanks, Bev, and thanks, Dailan, so much for presenting. Really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. And we'll be in touch. And, you know, really this is one step along the way in terms of habitat protection across New South Wales. It's really critical that we use all the opportunities that we have to keep the pressure up on the state government to end native forest logging and to protect koala habitat. So thanks for all that you do, and thanks for being here with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your work.
Thanks for coming.